Hello, everyone, and welcome to this Lunchtime Lecture series. My name is Nigel Kettley. I'm Academic Director and University Associate Professor. And what I'd like to do for this session is talk to you about social class and life chances. In particular, what should and can be done to tackle inequality. My research background is really as an educational researcher specializing in social inequality. But what I'd like to do for this session is really focus on how the cost of living crisis that we've all experienced over the last 2 or 3 years has brought focus to issues of social inequality. So in this session, I'll start off by talking about what is the cost of living crisis. I'll progress to talk about what is social class and what are life chances, giving you a definition of the former and also some examples of life chance inequalities by education and health. And finally, I'll focus on an academic approach from the work of Atkins to what can and should be done to tackle social inequality. Often in a session like this, I'd also look at political approaches to tackling social inequality, but we have a relatively short amount of time in this lunchtime lecture, so I'll keep it really focused on that academic approach. One of the things I've noticed over the last 3 or so years is the ways in which the media report the cost of living crisis in a very specific way. So there are two dominant approaches to media representations of the cost of living. One approach is to really focus on those who are struggling and people, for example, disabled people, the elderly, who are really struggling, those on benefits. So there's a focus on an issues-based approach to the cost of living crisis. Or more recently, in some of the press, we've seen a focus on issues of how middle class people have dealt with the cost of living crisis. So increasingly, we've seen headlines like UK middle classes struggling despite incomes of up to 60k a year. Now, what I think about media coverage of the cost of living crisis is being pretty partial, fragmented, and incomplete. So let's start off with what is the cost of living crisis, and then I'll really drill down into what are some of my key arguments in this session. I think many of the texts that I've read, certainly scholarly texts, but also media accounts and government accounts, tend to assume that we all know what the cost of living crisis is. They don't really define it and don't define it particularly well. So here I've selected a really good definition of the cost of living crisis from the work of Roberts. And forgive me, I'll just go through this because it really unpacks a lot of important information. For Roberts, the observation is that wages and welfare payments aren't keeping pace with the rise in cost of living, particularly the rise in things like energy bills, fuel, housing, food costs. But Roberts also drills down into the fact that the cost of living crisis isn't only an individual thing, it's also faced by businesses and public service providers. So it's not just the money that individual households have to cope that is under stress. It is also the budgets of businesses, welfare state services like the NHS. These public services and business budgets are really squeezed, which is adding pressure to people's standard of living. For example, businesses reducing people's hours at work or laying people off, NHS not being able to provide as much service for the amount of money they have. So disposable incomes and budgets are falling, and that has put increased stress and pressure on people in terms, for example, of their mental health. And this process has been ongoing since the mid of 2021. Some of my ideas related to the cost of living crisis are essentially the things I've been reading over the last 3 years or so, I think present a fragmented, partial account. For example, as I've said in the media, focusing on either the disadvantaged or the middle class. The cost of living crisis is rarely presented in the media or academia in terms of social class inequality. Clearly, those people from more disadvantaged social class backgrounds are going to be suffering more. Also, the cost of living crisis has been presented in a way which ignores intersectionality. And what I mean by that is the way in which some people occupy multiple positions of disadvantage in society. So we occupy class positions, we have a given ethnicity, gender, and these personal characteristics can intersect to make our life chances and our experiences of the cost of living crisis worse. I'll give you an example in a little moment. So we only have a partial understanding of the issue. Many of you will be aware, I'm sure, of inflation increasing over the cost of living crisis. So, for example, in December 2020, inflation stood at just over 0.5% and peaked in October 2022 at 11.1%. That was the peak of the cost of living crisis. And on this image, we can actually see the constituent elements of that. Food prices increasing, housing prices increasing, transport, and other costs like clothing. Quite clearly, the cost of living crisis, or at least the rate of inflation, has been brought under control to some extent, with it currently standing at 3.5%, but it's still substantially higher than the Bank of England's target. At the same time, the cost of living crisis has actually seen a reduction in weekly earnings for all sectors of the economy. This graph is actually reproduced from the work of Honoran, and Honoran actually gives us a really good image of the way that weekly earnings have fallen over the period 2000 to 2022. So if we look at December 2020, 21, 22, the last three portions of this graph, we can see for the whole economy, the dark blue line that's hiding quite nicely away there behind the orange line, real wages have fallen. And that's true for every sector, whether it is financial workers who are highly paid, their real income has fallen, or wholesale, retail, and hotel workers, where we see a decline in their wages too. So the cost of living crisis is manifold. It combines a reduction in real wages and an increase in prices at the same time. But when I said earlier, we experience the cost of living crisis in terms of the intersection of our personal characteristics. So taking the example of gender, and this is one that Honoran and many other people actually do discuss in the literature on the cost of living crisis, the crisis hasn't affected everyone equally. And it's argued by feminist economists and others that women have tended to bear the brunt of the cost of living crisis. And there are many reasons for this. The cost of living crisis is gendered because the decline in real wages has actually led to an increase in the unpaid work that some women, indeed many women, are doing. Your budget is falling, you actually have to struggle more with shopping, budgeting, childcare, housework, taking on more tasks yourself to save money. And women still do a disproportionate share of housework, 60%, and childcare, some estimates up to 80 or more percent. Women are also more likely to be at the lower end of the income distribution, so they occupy more jobs in sectors of the economy that are low paid and characterized by precarious employment, for example, some retail work, and therefore those sectors have been vulnerable in the cost of living crisis. And women have been vulnerable to layoff, company closure, reduced income, etc. Likewise, historically, women have tended to be concentrated in terms of employment in the public service sector, areas like education, health, social care, and those areas experienced pay freezes from 2010 onwards under the coalition government, and also real wages in those areas have continued to be relatively stagnant or decline throughout the cost of living crisis. And finally, women are more likely to be lone parents than men. So when I was talking about intersectionality, what I'm saying is we don't all experience the cost of living crisis the same. We experience it in many different ways according to our age, social class, gender, ethnicity, the region we live in, for example. I'm sure that most of you will be aware of the primary causes of the cost of living crisis, and I've referred here to them as a perfect storm. If we just think about some of the things that we've experienced in our society, austerity from 2010 onwards and the reduction in government spending, for example, 51% cuts in local government spending. The Brexit vote in 2016 and our consequent leaving of the European Union in 2020, and the shocks and impact that had on trade with Europe. The COVID-19 pandemic and the global recession that led to, and stagnation in trade with some areas. Russia's invasion of Ukraine 3 years ago, and the energy price shock that led to, and considerable increases in costs of electricity, gas domestically, knock-on impact in terms of business costs. We've also seen certain governments take political decisions, for example, Liz Truss's government's mini budget in late 2022, and the impact that had on the economy, and in particular, interest rates. And finally, there are causes that have affected the long-term cost of living crisis about government spending. Government welfare spending has tended to increase, but certain areas of spending, like long-term cuts in housing benefit, have reduced some people's income and therefore made them more vulnerable to the cost of living crisis. So what I want to progress to now is ask, what's all this got to do with social class? Because most of us in our mind have images of social class. We think of the working class, the middle class, the upper class. And as Marwick said a long time ago now, these images are built from the way we're socialized and learn about our society. And we develop lay models of social class. Many of us think of social class in terms of language and the forms of language people use. Different dispositions and tastes. For example, reading The Sun, is it working class? Reading The Guardian, is it middle class? Consumption of cultural artifacts like going to the opera or the ballet, is this a sign of being middle class? And also family relationships and marital relationships. There's some evidence to show that, for example, parenting varies by social class. So in everyday life, we construct images of class, and has been recognized for a long time. These images of social class coincide often quite well with academic images of social class. So I love the quote there from Reid: social class is a concept readily understood by the average person, but difficult to define. In recognizing that class is not a simple factor, but an amalgam of factors that operate in different ways in different circumstances, such a person has arrived at the same view as the professional sociologist. I think that's really very true. And when we think about academic definitions of class, then we're really talking about 2A here, the idea that we can group people into occupational categories, what are called employment aggregate groups, and define their class through those experiences. But class also refers to common prestige and status, and as we will see, life chance inequalities. So today in the UK, when we talk about social class, the most common way of measuring social class is the National Statistics Socioeconomic Classification. And this is a government scale of occupations devised in the 1990s to replace the Registrar General scale, came into practice and use in 2021. So the scale the government use, which is well tested, is Class 1, higher managers; 2, low managers, administrative staff; 3, intermediate occupations. We might consider those class positions middle class; 4, small employers, lower supervisory; 5, 6, semi-routine; 7, routine. And we might consider those positions working class. And that type of scale has been around a very long time. But this begs the question that many students ask me, so if we accept the class structure looks like that, and we can group people into those occupational categories, how is the class structure of the UK actually composed? Well, here I've taken figures from the 2021 census, which give us a really clear indication for England and Wales of the occupational composition of the population. So managing directors at 12.9%, I won't read through all of them for reasons of time. Professional occupations in England, 20.3%, all the way down to elementary or unskilled occupations, 10.5% both in England and Wales. So this gives us a visual image of the occupational structure and the class structure of the UK. And those of you who are savvy will know that the occupation structure has been changing. So in my lifetime, we've seen a decline in what we might consider skilled, semi-skilled and unskilled working class jobs, and a substantial increase in professional jobs and intermediate occupations. And that's been related to things like deindustrialization, foreign competition, etc. Life chance is a very similar concept to social class, and it was developed by the sociologist Max Weber. And basically, life chances refer to your opportunity of securing desirable resources in a society. And you'll probably have heard politicians talking about your life chances in Parliament all the time. And basically all they're acknowledging is what Weber did, saying that people from a higher social class background have better life chances. There's a positive correlation between the two. And to try and evidence this claim, so I'm not just making it up, I unsurprisingly decided to look at some of the statistical evidence. So if we look at things like A-level achievement, and this is one of my areas of research specialism, we can see that if we divide A-level students into those who are not disadvantaged, measured by not receiving free school meals, and those who are disadvantaged, receiving free school meals, and then we look at average A-level point score per A-level entry, we can see there's been a persistent gap in A-level achievement between those two groups of over 4% since 2019. Actually peaked in the pandemic at 5.09% and has just started to tail off. But it's still a relatively substantial gap when that relates to half of a grade E at A-level standard. Likewise, if we think about progression to university, this is actually measuring progression using a system called Polar, which looks at where you live and the socioeconomic characteristics of your postcode area. But if we look at progression rates for the most advantaged, over 60% go to university in 2022. For the most disadvantaged, that figure is closer to 30%, half as much. But the interesting thing here is the consistency of these lines over time, i.e. rates of progression to university haven't closed much. If that doesn't depress you, and I'm afraid it does me as an educational researcher, when we start to think about more substantial inequalities like how long we live, a very famous study conducted by Michael Marmot, the Marmot Review, which was updated in 2020, shows that since 2010, life expectancy in England has stalled. And this hasn't happened since 1900. And life expectancy follows the social gradient, meaning the more deprived area you live in, the worse your life expectancy is likely to be, and vice versa. So that amongst women in the most 10% of deprived areas, life expectancy actually fell between 2010 and 2016. And these trends are expected to continue as the cost of living crisis bites. So for both men and women, there have been large decreases for lower social class individuals or those occupying lower social positions. But the people who have experienced the best improvement in their longevity and health have been those living in the wealthiest areas of London. Again, we can actually see that this is mirrored in the pandemic. So here what I've done is take occupational class, so the class scale I referred to earlier, from managers to elementary occupations. These statistics are for men, and they show that basically the higher your social class in the pandemic, the lower the death rate from COVID-19. And those men working in caring, leisure, and service occupations and elementary occupations like bus driver, for example, or care worker, they were more likely to die of COVID. And those patterns are also true for women, but not quite as at such a pronounced rate. So I haven't reproduced the figures for women, but they are available in the Office for National Statistics data. So to sum this all up in terms of the cost of living crisis and social class, what we've got to think about is the myriad ways in which, for example, our economic position interacts with our health. And I love this diagram taken from Roberts again. So if we think of in the center increases in the cost of living experienced by the individual, and again, I won't go through them all, but energy, as energy prices increase, that creates dilemmas like, do we eat or do we heat our houses, particularly amongst the elderly and those on benefits? Cold homes can lead to vulnerability and disease. And this is true of the sort of compounding or aggregating effects of all of these issues related to the cost of living crisis. So there's a sort of systemic integrating effect that disadvantages us. This leads me, I think, forward to the question, what can be done? If we accept that the cost of living crisis is with us and it is real, which I hope some of the evidence I have shown you does actually demonstrate, and that it affects different people in different ways, related not just to their gender or ethnicity, but the prime issue here for me is their social class, i.e. the occupation they do and the income they have either from work or, for example, from a pension or state benefits. We need to think about what can be done to tackle inequality. When I give the full version of this lecture, I actually go through 3 or 4 different governments' approaches to tackling inequality, but unfortunately, I don't have time to go through Thatcher, New Labour, the coalition, the more recent Conservative governments here. So I'm just going to focus on the work of Atkinson, Inequality, What Can Be Done? And I think this is a really good book. It's a long read, but it's well worth it. And Atkinson is a political scientist, and the book suggests things that can be done to tackle inequality, both in the UK and the US. So when I look at some of these recommendations, we have to bear in mind some of them are more appropriate to the US than the UK context. So one of Atkinson's first recommendations is governments need to embrace technological change. We need to recognize we live in a changing world with the growth of AI, but we need to emphasize the service sector and the human element of service provision in order to maximize employment in the service sector. Likewise, he argues that we need more balance between stakeholders in the policy process or making process. So there needs to be much more focus, he argues, on the role of trade unions in developing policy to tackle inequality, and much more emphasis on redistribution of income and wealth. And for me, the fundamental answer, what can be done? We have to redistribute income and wealth. So how do we do that? Well, we can adopt targets for preventing and reducing unemployment. We can say the current rate of unemployment is X. We seek as a government to reduce it by 40% in the next 5 years. And we're not doing that. We can, this is particularly related to the US, adopt a national pay policy. In the UK, we have a minimum wage and we have a living wage, but Atkinson is basically focusing that on the US. Adopt a more progressive rate of personal income tax. So he argues in the UK we should have a rate of income tax at 65% at the top band, not 45%. When I last taught this in person, somebody in the audience said, I remember in the 1960s, the top marginal rate of income tax in the UK was 95%. So he wasn't particularly alarmed by the 65%, but many people will be. Inherited wealth should be taxed more progressively. So, there should be a lifetime capital receipt tax, and, you pay more tax on money you inherit. Property-based taxes, and here in the UK, we're thinking about council tax, should be more progressive, and they should be based on up-to-date property values. Child benefit should be increased according to Atkinson, and there should be a removal of the two-child limit to the amount of benefit you can receive. And more generally, Atkinson argues that we need to raise the level of all state benefits, including the pension, and renew social insurance, national insurance policies to make that possible. So he's making comments in response to observations like 1 million people in the UK are actually using food banks. So to try and draw my session together, what I've tried to do here is, in a whirlwind tour, I would describe it, is actually look at some of the definitions and causes of the cost of living crisis. Try to introduce you to what is social class, how is it measured, what does it mean, and to try and place the cost of living crisis in the context of social class, because this is rarely ever done in current academic work. For me, the cost of living crisis is a class issue. It's about the distribution of income and wealth related to jobs or state redistribution through benefits, pensions, etc. And I've talked about life chance inequalities like education and health and how they're impacted by social class. So my beginning argument was that we tend to have relatively partial coverage, incomplete coverage in the media, focusing on fragmented issues or on a binary view of social class, the working class and the middle class. And it's funny how much time the middle class have taken up in the press coverage of the cost of living crisis when they're not suffering as much as others. And what I tried to do, flagging up the work of Atkinson, was point out what can be done to tackle inequality. And of course, the message there is one of redistribution. The political will needs to be found to actually produce an agenda to substantially redistribute resources. And that's a question of political judgment, and it's a question of political ideology and beliefs about social justice. You might say, he's being completely idealistic. This just isn't possible. No government is going to redistribute on such a massive scale. But I would finish by reminding you about the introduction of the National Health Service in 1944. It was agreed upon by the wartime coalition government, introduced by the Labour Party in 1944. And if you think about the act of redistribution that underpinned the creation of the NHS, it was about creating access to healthcare irrespective of ability to pay and irrespective of the background or the social class of the person. And of course, we're talking about ability to pay at the point of use. I'm not going to read all of this quote to you, but there are some bits that I think are quite remarkable. The government want to ensure that in future, every man and woman and child can rely on getting all the advice and treatment and care which they may need in matters of personal health, that what they get shall be the best medical care and other facilities available, that their getting these shall not depend on whether they can pay for them or on any other factor irrelevant to the real need. If you look at the scale of political ambition underpinning the NHS white paper, it was massive. And to tackle social inequality, it would be my contention, that's what we need again. I've used an awful lot of references in this presentation, and if you're interested, they're on the slide in front of you and on the slide there. Okay, I hope you've enjoyed the session. I hope it's been valuable, and I hope your lunchtime was long enough to get through it and enjoy it. Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.